Hello and welcome to Against the Law, the myth-busting ancient history podcast that aims to flush away misconceptions about the ancient world. We're absolutely potty about bringing you the facts about ancient life. Let's see if you can guess today's subject matter. In lieu of a real gavel, we use this sound effect when we stumble upon a historical rumour. Wiping away the myths about ancient Rome today, we've got Zenia. Our Meg is on a roll as she clears up the rumours about ancient Greece, which, by the way, you shouldn't be putting down the drain. And lifting the lid on all things ancient Near East, we have Barney. They say you can't polish a turd, but here I am. It's me, Flo. I don't know much about the ancient world, but I cannot wait for today's topic. It's very dear to my heart. A few years back, I travelled to the Roman site Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, and I found myself completely intrigued by the drains and toilets carving their way through the landscape. It was a powerful moment, standing over an excavated drain and contemplating human existence. I was transported back in time when Roman poos once bobbed along this purpose-built channel. What? Everybody poos? You guessed it, today's topic is waterworks, including but not limited to toilets, sewers and drainage.
Flo, I'm so happy to hear that you had such a wonderful existential moment at Vindolanda.
It was very moving, yeah. I think that something that I love about history is when I can draw a parallel from ancient life to modern life. There are some things that don't change, and those things are graffiti, drains. We all need somewhere to poo. We all need somewhere to buy food. And I found it very, very moving. And also, I'd heard a rumour that ancient Romans, if they had something expensive that broke, like a nice brooch, they threw it in a drain or a ditch sometimes as an offering. And I just wanted to test the theory and see if any archaeologists had missed it, but they hadn't. I didn't come away with any stolen finds.
So you were rummaging around in that drain at Vindolanda trying to find a nice bracelet.
I was. So yeah, I was absolutely fascinated by the archaeological dig at Vindolanda, and there's numerous digs all around Hadrian's Wall where there were lots of Roman settlements. I also didn't realise that you have viaducts, which is a place that takes you via somewhere else. It's a form of travel. And you also have aqueducts, and actually that's how you pass water from one place to another, because obviously we take it for granted that we turn on a tap, we've got water wherever we want it in our homes. But the ancients had to come up with more complex ways of getting water from one place to another.
Yeah, exactly. So they didn't tend to have running water. They wouldn't sort of turn on a tap, but they did have a lot of public fountains, and those would be supplied by various different networks of aqueducts. And piping that then led from the aqueducts, because the aqueducts transport huge quantities of water, and then obviously that gets sort of siphoned off into individual piping networks. So in the streets they would have their public fountains in which you could collect water for drinking, washing, whatever you needed to do, and it would also run into the baths, the public baths, and public toilets. So those would be loads of people would use them at the same time. There would be like rows of seats, so you can still see them in some as you did in Vindolanda and in other ancient towns around the ancient world. You can see these sort of seats which all have rows of holes in them, and you'd have people sitting on those. Around the floor you'd have drains sort of draining out any of the wastewater, and often those would be placed next to public baths so that they could use some of the wastewater from the baths to then flush through the toilet areas. But despite all of that, we do have evidence saying that they were still fairly smelly.
I bet they were. I mean, that sounds like an absolute nightmare in terms of infection control, because in more recent history, of course, we have this story of Jon Snow stopping not the Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, but Jon Snow, the physician, stopping the outbreak of infection or preventing any more damage by removing a pump handle from a compromised water pump in London. I don't know the story that well, especially considering I went to Jon Snow College, but that
cholera, I think it was specifically the cholera outbreak.
Was it?
In the mid 19th century, is that right? And he mapped out all the cases of cholera and realized that they were sort of circled around this one water pump. So yeah, I think that infection control and sanitation is such a key thing. if you have a big city with lots of people and all their different illnesses, which obviously like that marks such a big change from, say, in like a hunter-gatherer society. You can just, you know, go where you like, wee and poo on the floor, and then because you're moving on all the time, you don't have that risk of infections arising from your own feces or your friend's feces. So I think that's a really interesting thing, is that there's that shift to like settling in places means that you then have to work out how to go to the loo again.
I think this is where the Mesopotamian case is quite a good one, because the ancient cities of Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium BC were some of the first cities in the world, some of the first examples of urbanism. They did have a lot of working out what to do with human waste, and it seems quite varied from a lot of the like ancient Sumerian cities like Ur and Nippur. Although they were quite big on their irrigation and drainage canals and stuff like that, I don't think it was unheard of to just have a diagonal slanting pipe coming out of a house and going onto the streets.
It's similar in some of the early Greek civilizations as well. So you've got the Minoan civilization, which is like a Bronze Age civilization in Crete, and they have some of the best, earliest sort of flushing toilets, running water. And the flushing toilet is really interesting. So this has been called on the internet the first ever flushing toilet. In the sense that, so it had like, apparently it has a sort of a hole in the floor just outside the door to the loo, and then an underground channel links that hole to the sort of pipe underneath the toilet. So someone could stand outside. They think it might have been like an attendant could stand outside, and as soon as you're done, you'd be like, yeah, I'm done, and then they would pour water down the hole. So it's, I think it's like, I get that it's flushing, but it's not self-flushing. It is, you still have to, either yourself or someone else has to pour the water down it. But yeah, then they would have like the pipes leading out to little sewers and drains leading into the street. So toilets were often on the edge of buildings because they needed to be near the walls to get the goods out again.
The concept of having streets filled with, were there drainage ditches, or was it just literally onto the street? Because I can't imagine I'd want to be walking around in barefoot or sandals or anything like that. I want high heels, stilettos, raising me above the turd level.
I think it varied. I think some Greek cities had drains and sewers, but some of them definitely would have just had stuff out and about. What about in the Mesopotamian cities, Barney?
Yeah, I've honestly got an impression of a variety as well. There was a couple of pieces of literature that I read, and it seems like there was no like unified system of doing it. And in trying to explain all the different waste management systems, one of these authors considered just scavengers.
What?
That like, yeah, that like a particular species of vulture might just come and take away any turds that were out in the street. So that's probably how little kind of civic planning there was around waste management at this point, that you might just have to leave it for the birds.
Like council employees. It's like, we're hiring for new position of poo hunting vultures.
Yeah. So I really wanted to read a brilliant quote from an author, Augusta McMahon, who said, "If waste from a house simply flows into an adjacent street, this may improve aesthetics within the house, but will do little for the health of its inhabitants or neighbours." I just love the idea that like it's like home comforts, like your house looking really nice, not being full of crap, but just literally having it outside the back door.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly.
That just goes to show that, you know, things really don't change. In Samuel Pepys' diary, he explains in one entry how upset he is because his neighbour's turds have floated into his basement.
Oh.
And he's very cross about it and the expense that he's had to go to fix it. And his neighbour says, "Those aren't my turds." And it's like this is really, really affecting, you know, the saleability of my home. Having Mr. Johnson's turds float by.
There's another really interesting thing. So, Zenia, you were just talking about the like public loos. So you've got those, yeah, in Greece you get very much the same, these kind of big latrines where you could seat like 20 people all around. But interestingly, in some of the palace complexes in Crete, you get toilets with 2 or 4, they call them defecation openings, even in a private toilet. And they don't quite know whether this is like, I mean, that kind of suggests that like you and your family would just go in together, and maybe that makes sense because of the flushing system. You'd want to do it all at once. But yeah, isn't that interesting? It'd be like when you're at the club with your friends, you're like, let's all go in the loo together. But there would have been multiple different loos for everybody in the same room, even in private residences.
I've got a question. Was this a mixed gender thing? Because there's a lot in the news about gendered toilets and whether we should have unisex toilets. And I'm wondering if the ancients actually got there first and had unisex toilets with lots of different defecation holes.
Great question. In terms of the private ones, it's unclear. I think possibly the implication is that it would still be like segregated by gender. But I don't know if it's in your private house, obviously, you can do what you want there. The public ones, that's actually a great question. I didn't check that. I'm assuming they were for men, but they might not have been. I think there might have been public toilets attached to buildings that would have been attended specifically by men or women, so like sort of certain gymnasiums and stuff. I don't know, Zenia, did you look at that?
I didn't look at that particularly, actually, but given that they were near baths, and we know that baths had separate, not always separate entrances, but definitely separate times that men and women would visit them, it would definitely make sense for there to be a certain amount of separation for men and women. The public space in general in the ancient world, I think, tends to be fairly male.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So some of the sort of some of the biggest like public toilets in ancient Athens, say, there's some Roman era ones at the Agora, and the Agora is the equivalent of the Forum, the kind of public space. And just because that would generally be attended by men, I'm kind of assuming that those ones would have been for men. But that's a great question.
So you just kind of have to, if you're a woman, you just have to kind of hold it until you can get back to your private defecation hole.
Yeah, like that thing about I don't think this is true, but there's like that sort of urban legend that a woman can go to the loo in a policeman's helmet.
So I know the truth about this, and this is against the law, but it's more modern against the law. And the truth is that a pregnant woman can pee wherever, whenever, including a policeman's helmet. She could technically pee into the fourth dimension. Okay, right. Okay, so I'm just I'm still caught up in how germy it would be to have poo in the streets. Even if you've got a poo-seeking vulture or bird of prey that comes and snaffles up your errant turds. That seems like a relatively dangerous and germy thing to do. Do we have any sort of doctor's opinions or medical opinions on having poo everywhere?
This kind of links back to some of what we were talking about with hospitals in that episode, because I think, again, this is that sort of turn of medical knowledge with Hippocrates in Greece, that he is very much saying health is a product of your environment. And I don't think he ever got as far as Jon Snow to be like, clearly, if you're drinking this water, you'll have this disease or whatever. But very much that awareness that it's not just caused by the gods' illness. So say if you had diarrhea, you'd be like, well, that might be because of the environment we're in.
Well, I find that quite interesting. I mean, was there any benefit to having human waste around? I mean, could it be used for anything? Barney, any tales from the ancient Near East about using human waste for something good?
Well, they definitely had kind of waste disposal areas at the edge of towns. And I think this is the case pre-urbanism as well. Which you'd call middens, midden, just a place where you'd go and put all the waste. So that could be organic waste, ceramic waste, just generally rubbish. And yeah, I think people could use that, as I think you'd find in a lot of settlements throughout time. People could use that as fertilizer. But the problem with urban waste is that a lot of it is less useful in an agricultural setting. You're not going to be able to use loads of baked clay to irrigate your fields. And so I know that in the ancient Near East, a lot of this waste did just build up into huge mounds. And the archaeology of the ancient Near East is dominated by sites called tells, which you see in even modern cities like Tel Aviv. And a tell is just an archaeological mound where, because of thousands and thousands of years of people living on the same site, they just raise up and up and up on the landscape, so they become these kind of artificial hills. But there's one particular example called Tel Majnuna at the edge of a famous Sumerian city called Tel Brak, which is 3 hectares and 7 meters high, and is entirely made of trash, including human. Yeah. And that would be the sort of place where they think you could take your buckets of crap.
I like that, because you're like, oh, where have you come from? You've made it to the big city. Where did you start out? Oh, a crappy little village, and it would be 100% correct. Like I really like that idea. That's crazy. You could take an apple corer through the entire centre of that area and just see like a timeline of waste.
I think that's what they do as well. It's part of archaeology called stratigraphy, where you can tell the age by the layers in the archaeology. And I think in arriving at these tells, they do just generally try and dig straight down, like a sort of a trench, and go back through the layers of crap.
I should have been an archaeologist. Great fun.
Another good thing about
sorry,
Tel Majnouna, Majnouna is an Arabic word meaning crazy. So this is just the crazy mound, which I really like.
That's great. Even they were like, this is a lot of shit.
This is nuts. So, Zenia, do you have any information on how because there's a famous bit in the Monty Python film, Life of Brian, where they say, what have the Romans ever done for us? And I know that part of that joke includes a sewage system.
Yeah, so they were fairly good with their sewage systems in terms of just flushing waste away. That was good. There's a woman called Anna Olga Kolosky Ostro, who's since sort of through her research on toilets has earned herself the nickname Queen of Latrines. And she argues
nice.
Something to aspire to. She argues that actually it wasn't that hygienic. So yeah, we've touched on like what a health hazard it would have been to have had poo floating about everywhere. Not least parasites. I mean, we've talked before in our hospital episode about ancient healthcare. And they may have been fairly good at surgery, and obviously they kept clean by going to the baths fairly often. But in terms of understanding of germ theory or parasites and how you got that, they didn't really have the same understanding that we have now. Reversing back to the sewers. The most famous sewer, arguably, is the one in Rome, and that was actually built in the 500s BC. So this is when Rome is still ruled by kings, and they're building that very early infrastructure of the city. It ended up carrying on being in use for 700 years. Whoa. And only needed one sort of major bout of repairs, and that was under Augustus. Augustus's sort of right-hand man was a guy called Agrippa. And he very famously undertook these huge repairs of this great sewer, the Cloaca Maxima. Cloaca meaning sewer, Maxima meaning the absolute biggest. And it really was an absolute unit. It was so big. They tunneled through various hills around Rome. Famously, Rome is built on 7 hills. And there are also little rivers that are tributaries to the big river that runs through Rome, the Tiber. And what they would do is tunnel through these hills and connect together these rivers so that it would flush through Rome underneath.
So you mentioned that it was called the Cloaca Maxima, and I've got to jump in and say the cloaca is the name of a bird's waste exit private part, like for both poo and wee and everything else. It all comes out of one place. Yeah, the multi-purpose waste disposal unit, which is the cloaca. So that must be where the word's from. That's really cool.
Pretty disparaging for the poor birds, isn't it, that their reproductive organs isn't just called sewer?
Yeah, that's true. At least it's not Cloaca Maxima. I think that would probably be more disparaging.
That's just shaming, isn't it?
I remember we had a chat with Caroline Lawrence in our episode about clothing, and she mentioned that people used to carry around a sponge on a stick for use in the toilet. So presumably you wouldn't have a bog roll. It was all a sponge on a stick and you had your own personal one.
Yeah, there may also have been shared ones in the public toilet.
No.
Yeah, not good. No. Really not good, especially when we're thinking about hygiene. It's like you've managed the running water, you've managed the sewer system, but you haven't managed the bottom wiping bit very well. That wasn't great. But also there were other dangers from going to the public toilets. Obviously the excrement goes down, but there isn't a way to stop anything coming back up. And this leads to all sorts of problems. One of them is a fairly obvious one, rats. They would live in the sewers and they may come up out of the hole and bite your bottom. The other issue is a build-up of gas. So toilet fires were fairly common. They just catch fire, and there would be like a toilet explosion from farts, from build-up of gas, from various other products.
You scent flow.
It's not funny because it's very dangerous to human life.
That would be so embarrassing. Can you imagine? You know when it's like, oh, leave that for a minute. When you come out of the loo, imagine being like, better leave that for a bit. I just did a fart so powerful. The whole building went up in flames.
Oh no! As well, fart gas is not to be sniffed at.
That's so good. Just to go back to the sponge on a stick, the spogia, I believe it was called. They've found some like latrines which have a sort of groove in the middle of the floor, which they think might have been for cleaning the spogia, which again very much suggests it might have been a shared experience. I thought that was cool. And they also used things called, the ancient Greeks used pessoi, or pesos is the singular, and they're pebbles, which is also an ancient board game, pessoi, but it's also the name for these pebbles that you can use to wipe your bum with. And I read a really funny article about them, which said, I'm just going to read out this one line to you. So they would be pebbles, quote, having been recut from old broken ceramics to give smooth angles that would minimise anal trauma. So that put me off.
What about emotional trauma, Meg?
Well, indeed.
That's all still there.
That's still there.
But there's an amazing vase, a red figure vase from the 6th century BC, which shows a man with his cloak wrapped around his shoulders, sort of pulled up, in a squat, clearly going in to wipe his bum. We will tweet it out. It is fantastic. I think it's one of the best pieces of art I've ever seen in my life. So yeah, you get the pesos, and some scholars have suggested that. So do you guys know like ostracism, but in the technical ancient sense?
No, I don't.
So ostracism is like actual ostracism, so you're kind of banning, exiling people, and there would be a sort of, you could write down people's names on an ostraka, which is like a bit of a pot, and then if someone gets enough sort of votes, they would be ostracized. So that's where we get the word ostracism. But some scholars have suggested that if you really hated that person, as well as trying to ostracize them, you would then use that bit of pot as your toilet paper. So you'd be like, oh, I really hate Socrates. I'm going to wipe my bum with this bit of pot with his name on it. And that would be like ultimate, you know, literally shitting on someone.
That's like the equivalent of having Donald Trump toilet paper or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's brilliant. That's quite impressive. I quite like that. I am quite terrified of things coming out the toilet anyway, because if you watch on YouTube, there's videos of, I will say it's mostly in Australia, where a lot of the wildlife is quite terrifying anyway, but like snakes coming up into the toilet, mice, rats, various wildlife. The concept of having something crawl up the toilet, back up the toilet, when things are supposed to, as Zenia said, go down the toilet, is quite terrifying. Are there any other stories that you've got, Zenia, of things crawling up the toilet that shouldn't?
Yes, there is one story by a writer called Aelian. And he tells a story about a merchant who lived in the city of Puteoli, which is by the sea. And he had his private toilet in his own house. He had it connected to the sewer system. This was fairly unusual, actually, in the ancient world. Usually private toilets within the house, they would just, you know, as Barney and Meg have been describing, just you poo into a bucket and then you empty the bucket. Or they were just sort of cesspits. But he was wealthy enough to have his toilet connected to the sewer system. And every night, an octopus swam up the sewer system, climbed out of his toilet, and ate all of the pickled fish in his pantry.
What?
What on earth?
That sounds like something a child would say, because they'd eaten all the pickled fish. And it's like, oh, so yeah, basically what happened was an octopus has been coming out of the toilet at night and eating the pickled fish, and it wasn't me.
This is one of the reasons I don't like octopuses.
one of many.
Who might eat my fish.
So was there a toilet near their kitchen then? Because that doesn't sound ideal.
Yeah, it's not a very healthy decision. I couldn't really get to the bottom of why they put their toilets next to the kitchen. But again, it's very much a lack of understanding of where germs come from.
I think the having it next to the kitchen, that's, I think, similar in ancient Greece as well. I think it might be partly just because their water distribution systems, while pretty impressive, were not actually that great. So you'd have your wastewater from the kitchen used to flush the toilet, or the wastewater from the bath used to flush the toilet. So it made sense to have them near each other, I think. Obviously, it does not make sense hygienically, but in terms of using the water.
I see. If you're going to be carrying around a big bucket of water or an amphora of water, you don't want to carry it further than you need to, kind of thing.
Yeah, or even having pipes. I think there are some examples from Crete where there'd be like a pipe coming from the kitchen to the bathroom.
Do we know anything about sort of like, are there any gods or deities or spirits or paranoias around toilets and waste?
I do have something about demons, actually. We've talked about these shared sponge sticks and public toilet gas fires. It all meant that the Romans could be fairly nervous about going into public toilets because they were also fairly dark and they were very smelly, and you didn't know who you'd find in there. So they were also worried that, you know, demons lived in dark places, and you could get evil demons coming out of these toilet holes, as well as octopuses or rats or whatever. So there is a story of someone who went to the toilet at night, and it was all a little bit nerve-wracking already, and then he saw this huge demon come out of the toilet and was very, very scared. We also don't know how much that person had to drink before they went into the public toilet. So I think we should probably take that story with a pinch of salt. But we do know that it was a concern that Romans had about going into public toilets.
Well, I share that concern. I hate public toilets.
There's also so the word hygiene actually is also a Greek-derived word from Hygeia or Hygeia, who's the goddess of sanitation and health and cleanliness. So the Greeks definitely also had the sort of slightly religious aspect to very religious aspect to how they dealt with health. And Hygeia is the daughter of Asclepius, the god of medicine, who we spoke a lot about in the hospitals episode.
Actually, you see that's a very similar linking of the number of phenomena you guys have just been describing there in Mesopotamia. That they had a toilet demon called Sulak,
Wow.
which they understood etymologically to mean dirty hands.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that Sulak could cause diseases. So there were omens, you know, just saying you do not go into the wash house, basically, lest you get visited by Sulak. So it's like this. There is a conception that like this place is not hygienic, and the dirty hands demon may strike you down.
That's really interesting, because obviously, having experienced and lived through a pandemic, and we still are, you know, one of the government's big drives is to wash your hands. So I find the concept that they've put the pieces together to go, if you've got dirty hands, you're at risk of spreading germs. Really interesting.
Yes, they should. What did you say the demon's name was? Sulak.
Yeah.
They should get Sulak back to do like a COVID, you know, advert being like
public service announcement.
Or Sulak will get you. Barney, did you come across a curse tablet? I was sort of accidentally strayed into your area of expertise, but apparently there was a curse tablet that was found in Mesopotamia where the curse was that someone should eat bread from a sewer pipe. So again, the conception there that would be a bad thing to do.
I didn't find that one, but that does sound very Mesopotamian.
Are there any other uses for human waste that I might not have thought of?
We mentioned before having the poo used as fertilizer, but the Emperor Vespasian also found a use for wee. And as we mentioned on our episode with Caroline Lawrence, this urine could be used as a way of cleaning clothes. So Vespasian put a tax on urine collection. So people would go around the public toilets and collect the urine in order for it to be used in laundries. And you could also sell your private urine, and he imposed a tax on that. When his son Titus criticised him for doing this and sort of mocked him, he supposedly said the famous phrase "pecunia non olet," which means money does not smell. And that's sort of been used by politicians ever since.
I find it absolutely bizarre that you could tax something that comes out of your body.
Yeah, the context of that is they just had the Emperor Nero, who was a big spender. And so Vespasian, he found these creative ways to get more money.
That is creative.
Zenia, did you know that French urinals used to be known as Vespasiennes because of Vespasian and the urine?
Really? Cool. Oh, I didn't know that.
I thought that was cool. I was having a look at what people thought about menstrual blood. And Pliny, the Roman writer, says that menstrual blood turns new wine sour, crops touched by it become barren, and hives of bees die.
It blows my mind that these people lived with women, were married to women, and yet had so little idea about how women's bodies worked.
They're a mystery.
All this chat has reminded me of a subsection of some of the later Babylonian medical texts, which is called the gynecological corpus. And they did have quite a lot to say in their medical tablets about like excess bleeding and hemorrhage and stuff like that. And it did play a significant part in some Babylonian medical texts. There's kind of recipes for treatment of pains and, you know, these kind of hybrid, you know, you include like one mineral and one part of an animal. And it was presumably not very hygienic. But yeah, some of it's quite poetic as well. I think there was an incantation that started, "Her blood is a carnelian river."
Oh,
Wow. There's an amazing story about one of my favourite women in all of history, Hypatia, who was around in the sort of 4th century AD, I think. She lived in Alexandria. And she was one of the earliest female mathematicians, which is already quite cool in itself. But even cooler than that, in my opinion, is that she was a lifelong virgin, apparently. This is obviously all, I think this is stories from like a few hundred years later, so it may well not be true, but they said she was a lifelong virgin, and that when one of the men who she taught came to sort of try and, you know, seduce her, she tried to soothe his lust by playing the lyre. But when he continued, he was like, no, I want to get with you. She threw her bloody menstrual rags at him.
I mean, that's iconic, isn't it?
Right? An absolute icon.
Does it say whether or not that put him off? I presume it would.
It says that, so this is, I think, Damascius is the writer, so I think a few hundred years later, said that the young man was so traumatized that he abandoned his desires for her immediately, which I think you would, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, that would put most people off.
Yeah, I think it's quite a good method, really. I think we can all learn from Hypatia.
Exactly, and if it doesn't put them off, it's time to get out the toilet, octopus. Well, I've learned a lot of things that I didn't previously know about the world of toilets, drains, sewers, etc. Let's talk about our favourite things. So, Zenia, what was your favourite thing that you learned from today?
I really love learning about the tell near Tel Brack from Barney, that translates as the crazy tell, because it's just so full of rubbish.
Me too. Barney, how about you? What was your favourite thing to learn today?
Well, I'm very glad that you started with Zenia because this was her story and I didn't want anyone else to steal it. I am, of course, obsessed with the idea of the toilet octopus.
No, that was my favourite fact as well.
I just can't. I couldn't resist. It's so good.
It's brilliant, isn't it? Meg, how about you?
Obviously, I was also going to say the toilet octopus, but my second favourite thing was the dirty hands toilet demon.
What was his name again, Barney?
Sulak.
Sulak, dirty hand toilet demon. Absolutely needs to be brought back for COVID hand washing measures.
Bring back Sulak.
Bring back Sulak.
I think my favourite thing, second obviously to all 3 facts that you've mentioned, is probably the exploding toilets. Just because, I mean, that's the peak of comedy right there, is it? Doing a fart so bad the toilet explodes. Thanks everyone. That was a fantastic episode.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Against the Law. If you enjoyed the episode and want more myth-flushing content, then follow us on Twitter and TikTok and support us on Patreon. Just search for Against the Law Podcast.